POI in chat. If I haven't taken a POI by 5:30, please feel free to unmute yourself and vocally ask for a POI. Panel, India has the highest population in the world currently right now, with one of the on the top to becoming the one of the biggest emitters in pollution in the world. This has significant impacts not on the a population within India, especially the vulnerable people on the coastal regions of India, within the urban cities like Delhi and Mumbai, which are covered in smog most of the time in the year, but also on the generally on global south as well, and affects vulnerable populations all across. There's a significant need for Indian government to implement methods and ways in which they can reduce climate. And we think this is the best approach to do that. Why do we need this? Because we think that starting with, first of all, why agriculture is important in this context. We think that the agriculture is one of the primary sources of carbon and methane emission in India, which comes largely from the way the crop unsustainable farming practices, crop and stubble burning, which are very low cost methods of farming and agricultural, which leads to problematic outcomes. Now, let's look at the policy of how cap and trade works and in terms of setup. We think that the Indian government is allowing the maximum cap, the maximum number of units of carbon that can be emitted through agriculture in the country and in the province on a more federal or a national level. So in terms of how it works is that you can assess how much you need to emit in total. So you can have sensors across the cities, different cities. You need a few logistical deployments in order to assess the overall emission, and then based off of that, you roll out limited number of permits, and each permit allows you to emit a certain number of units of carbon emission. So for instance, a small firm would need maybe one permit, a big firm would need 100 permits, but because the overall number of permits in the market remain the same, the overall emissions from within the agriculture sector remains capped at that floor level. This setup is extremely important in terms of how we take this debate forward. Two things in our speech. First, why we think that governments are bad regulators in terms of when they are micromanaging how much emissions each firm has to do, and why market-driven solutions such as cap and trade policies are more effective. And secondly, why it creates more efficiency and more sustainable practices. Before that, if there are any clarifications from the top pitch. No. Okay. So why governments are bad actors in terms of micromanaging this? What the world of opposition looks like if they want to tackle the issue of climate change and agricultural output is that the government would need to assess each farmer or each farming units produced individually, and they will have to decide how much each of that unit emits. We think that this is logistically much more difficult, especially in the Indian context where we have is a large number of small and medium farmers, but at the same time also means that the quantity of farmers and farming industries is a lot. It is virtually very difficult, and especially in the context of it being a developing country with a history of colonialism, means that the institutions are weaker, their ability to assess that will be much more difficult. Thirdly, we think that the technology that each agricultural firm has varies significantly, and it therefore bureaucrats do not have the necessary technical knowledge and understanding of what the particular emission from each agricultural unit necessarily needs to be. This means that it makes it logistically difficult for you to enforce in the opposition's world any kind of mechanism. And even if you do want to enforce that, there are lots of leakages and potential of corruption in their world, because it means that lower levels of bureaucratic staff will be engaging with each firm individually, each agricultural unit. So because of bribery, because of corruption, means that you don't get the levels of output, don't get the overall level of cap that you want to achieve under their world. Under our world, it is far more easier to enforce this policy, because you just assess on a national level how much the total level of emission needs to be. So you could have few limited number of sensors deployed over a city to assess how much it needs to be. The prime minister, the chief leader, the high-ranking officials can monitor and assess that easily. And based off of that, the market can trade amongst themselves the overall number of emissions. And if there are any violators, if the people who have if the overall emissions go above a certain point, it's easier for you to pinpoint, identify, and see which permitter is abusing its scheme, which permit holder is over emitting beyond its limit. What we get on our side is a better implementation of a carbon emission and carbon emitting policy, means that you're much likelier in your ability to enforce that. This is going to be potentially prior to everything that OO or CO says, because this means that your implementation capacity largely determines the outcomes. Second, why does it help and change the status quo? Because it is going to increase the cost of business operations. Notice also that Punjab is one of the most prosperous regions of India, which means that the ability to innovate, and given the right kinds of incentives that this system creates, the big firms and the big large agricultural firms will be able to innovate and be able to develop sustainable agricultural practices without agriculture practices. And then therefore, this means that you get more cleaner and efficient outcomes generally. Secondly, we think there's a low-hanging fruit here that almost even the small farmers can capitalize upon, because it gives them an additional source of income for small farmers if they implement more sustainable and low carbon practices, because now they can sell their carbon credits to other big firms, for instance, if they don't require that, if they're emitting lesser number of emissions, and therefore it increases their additional source of income as well. So overall, you get more sustainable farming practices. CO?
How harsh do you think the new target is relative to current production?
We think that this target is essentially not harsh, in a way that it is quite iterative as well, because you could see that the overall level of emissions, you can assess periodically whether or not, for instance, you need to raise the target, you need to lower the target. It's far more easier for you to do that, as opposed to the counterfactual world, where you do not necessarily get the logistical capacity to implement it in the first place. But under our world, where you get the ability to implement it more fully, this also means that if the policy doesn't work, you know exactly where the problems are, and you can iterate it accordingly, and therefore you get better outcomes. Back to the argument about why it's a low-hanging fruit. We think that a lot of the farmers and a lot of the agricultural industry within Punjab have no incentive currently to innovate whatsoever. But when you raise the cost of doing business, if their cost of doing business is significantly higher because of these permits, means that they necessarily will have to move away from practices like stubble burning and crop burning. And there's an immediate benefit to it as well. It's not long-term benefit, because issues like smog and poor air quality, with Delhi ranking as the worst city in the world in air quality, that improvement happens immediately, and that immediacy means that we get benefits on our side relatively quickly, but also the long-term benefits of generally having a better climate. For all these reasons, very proud to propose.
I thank the previous speaker. I'm happy to call upon the leader of the opposition.
All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Perfect. My time will start now. OG has this odd assertion that the counterfactual in this debate is micromanagement of every company. This debate is not about that. Let's think realistically. The counterfactual is either significantly less regulations or free markets entirely, as one, this debate is about implementing some sort of restrictions or policy, and two, if we look at India, that's what Modi was running for office on, freer markets and less restrictions. We think they characterize this debate rather poorly. But when we go into more substantial arguments, I think OG may have been reading our case for us, because our first argument is going to be about how implementation is likely to be corrupt and discriminatory. We have four mechanisms here. First is going to be about company favoritism, because the government of India has preferential treatment for specific companies. Some companies have ties to the BJP, the ruling party. The BJP is now also encouraging civil servants to start being party members. These are literally the people that are going to be in charge of enforcing these restrictions onto corporations. That's why you're going to see in the long term that since many big companies are family conglomerates, they have close ties with the government, they may get preferential treatment. These are the exact same companies that are giving gifts, donations to politicians, which actively increases the incentive for there to be favoritism and unequal treatment, because people want money in order to be elected. This means that in the long term, you're either not going to have solvency or things are going to get worse. We'll talk about that later. The second mechanism is under regional favoritism. India has a clientele economy base. Politicians are personally popular in their specific areas, and they focus on their specific areas to provide benefits right back to their region. In practice, what this looks like is that areas that get unfairly targeted, whether or not they voted for the Congress party, the opposition party right now, or if they're Muslim or ethnic minority areas, the government is realistically going to enforce these quotas probably even harder onto those areas, probably going to regulate them more because they have all these resources and they're not regulating the actual people that they care about. They're only focusing on the people that they already do not care about, which means that you're going to have a significantly skewed implementation of this policy. Third is you're going to see that since the policy is deeply unpopular with the voter base, if it's implemented, it'll probably be implemented poorly. Realistically, as opening government concedes, the only reason emissions are high is because people are going with the cheapest possible way. They are creating food. They are doing the agricultural industry through low-cost means. If you implement this sort of restriction, you are only actively dragging up prices for your average Indian citizen and making their quality of life significantly worse, which is only going to be worse in the long term. The government knows this, and if they implement the policy, they're probably going to do it in a more corrupt way, try to do less restrictions, such that they actually don't end up harming the lives of all of their constituents. And the fourth mechanism here is that India is fucking massive. There are 1.4 billion people in the nation. They're saying build sensors in every single region. Let's think about this logically. That's one, going to cost time, two, going to cost money, and three, going to be very difficult to actually maintain and implement to make sure people are meeting those quotas, not going over them, and things such as that. Realistically, you're not going to impose effective caps on big companies. Conversely, you punish those that lack capital to fight back, which is going to result in more emissions in the long term because it's going to make the people think that something is actually being done. You check the news and you see a policy is being passed, so you think that the problem is being solved, but if the root cause of the problem is still not being addressed, the only thing this creates is cruel optimism where people lose all incentive to actually put in more work and more effort to solve the root cause of this issue. I'll take closing right now.
If India is so corrupt, you can screw the companies in other ways, such as lawsuits, subsidies, permits, etc. This is not comparative.
The argument isn't inherently comparative. The argument is a specific problem with the plan and the resolution that we are talking about in this round, which is that it's not going to lead to any of the positive benefits that government talks about. That is mainly the argument that we're putting forward. I don't see how that addresses our case at all. Second, we would say that even in a perfect implementation, a carbon cap would still suck. A couple mechanisms again. First, this places India at a huge disadvantage versus China and other countries. Your wages go down, goods get more expensive. You negatively affect a population of 1.4 billion people, specifically in the short term. This also probably destroys India's export market, which is going to make their currency get even worse, destroying the purchasing power of the individuals in India, which is an actively larger impact in the short term, because as I'm going to talk about in the next mechanism, this also affects climate change. The environmental Kuznets curve is an empiric relationship that it talks about how countries can actually reduce emissions. Middle-income countries, specifically like India, are more dependent on their natural resources and extraction industry, as opposed to high-income countries that are more focused on service and more retail industries that are less environmentally devastating. If we are actively hurting India, we are forcing them back into the hands of the natural extraction industry. They're going to be doing more environmental damage within their own nation, as opposed to economic growth, which can shift the model of where their business actually happens in, which can lead to less emissions in the long term. Third mechanism is that when companies make less money, as Gov concedes that they will, they can't go green. It is a luxury that is not a necessity, because you don't need to be green in order to have a business model. However, under their plan, you have significantly less money, which means that if you have a choice to go green, you're probably going to save that money instead, because your operating cost is already significantly higher, or you're just going to leave the country and take out all of those sorts of businesses. Gov will mention imports, but they fail to mention that none of these imports from the West or other things are going to be specific to the Indian climate or the Indian solution, which means that you need to have local specific companies doing this sort of innovation. The environment is always going to be a more long-term issue because people are suffering right now. And since this goes against the preferences of the majority of India, people losing their careers and their livelihoods, the Indian government obviously should care more about this. At worst, on our side, some people get hurt by environmental pollution through omission, while on their side, you are actively hurting 1.4 billion people by making a decision. India has more of an obligation to its own internal citizens than anywhere else. Now I'll get into a little bit of preempting on Gov, because you're going to hear things of like, oh, they're not going to be corrupt. People will take it to like court and stuff. But India as a nation has relatively weak institutions because it's enormous. It has a decentralized, starved court system. Chris tells me there's like a 20-year backlog of cases that only get selectively chosen to go to trial, which only makes the favoritism issue even worse because, of course, a company is not the nation is not going to prosecute someone that is their largest donator. And then second, they might say something about backlash, but that's a little bit of a silly argument because no one actually understands the specifics of the issue. And second, they probably don't support the specifics of the plan because all that they know is that it's making their cost of life, their food, their everyday life significantly more difficult. I could not be prouder for opening opposition.
And I thank the previous speaker. I'm happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Super. Just one sec, and I couldn't send to recording. Okay, Pure Eyes, please turn on your camera, raise your hand. I am very sick, so if I break out into a cough, I'll just pause my time and then continue on my next word. Agricultural activities' impact on the environment is consequential insofar as it creates a circularity problem. The first people to be affected by climate inaction, climate crises, and environmental destruction are farmers whose efforts towards food production depend on the availability of stable rainfall, of freedom from massive environmental disasters like floods and cyclones, and crucially, clean air. It is for those reasons that targeting the agricultural sector is so important. To be perfectly clear, though, this motion does not start and end at the agricultural sector. The info slide tells us that the agricultural sector is the starting point, but there is absolutely an opportunity to allow this model to trickle down to other sectors, which we think invariably will happen and will have to happen, especially when you think about, for example, the impact that automotives have on the environment. A bit of framing before I get into two clashes. First, what is our model? The first thing I want to note is that India knows how much it emits and how much it needs to emit in order to prevent large-scale climate disaster. The reason why it knows is because India is involved in things like massive international protocols for climate action, like the Paris Agreement, that have reporting guidelines and reporting expectations, but also crucially set expectations in terms of how much emissions are necessary in order to make sure that India remains below things like the kinds of tipping points that would yield massive environmental disasters. I think this responds to the logistical concern from OO in terms of the difficulty of measuring just how much emission is necessary. Because we're happy, for example, to bite the bullet and say it might be very expensive to set up sensors in every city, even though the motion says that there's strategies that have been put into place to ensure this happens. But we definitely know that at a national level, this is how much we need to emit. We'll simply divide that by, say, 1,000 and have individual permits that are worth whatever number that is and distribute those permits. But it's true, India has a specific interest in climate action because currently India is under massive fire from the international community for its refusal to engage in climate action in the manner that, for example, China has refused to engage in climate action, that the US has refused to engage in climate action, and so on. This creates a specific impetus for the Indian government to engage in this. OO says their counterfactual should be significantly less regulation or a free market altogether. But to be clear, the alternative that Abrar gives them is the easiest and most charitable alternative for them to defend. Because we're saying that on both sides, it's reasonable to presume that we do want to lower emissions. It's reasonable to presume that we do want to preserve the environment. If OO chooses a world in which they defend no efforts, for example, at regulation, and chooses to defend a world in which they don't do anything to respond to the environmental crisis that is on them, it means they lose the second clash on the environment and why it is so important to preserve the environment. The first question I want to answer is the question of whether the government is appropriately placed to engage in the regulation of carbon emissions. Abrar tells you that because the alternative is likely regulation at an individual level of corporations, the Indian government just doesn't have the capacity necessary to engage in these individual level monitorings of how much every corporation is emitting and how much it needs to be emitting. Regardless of if you believe what OO says about why this is not the alternative, I think the capacity sensitivity analysis stands either way, because any other model of regulating environmental emissions is likely faced with the same capacity problems. If, for example, you choose no preemptive regulation, but do choose to punish companies for engaging in large-scale emissions, this still has a massive regulation problem insofar as the same problems of government corruption that Abrar identifies still exist. Because of this, Abrar notes that it is necessary to yield and to cede control over the market for carbon to an actual market that's engaged in trading for these carbon permits. That is, that you measure how much demand there is for these things and you maintain a constant supply of permits, and then the market determines just how much it wants to pay in order to preserve this environment. It is likely that the price of these permits will be high, significantly high, specifically because every large company has an interest in ensuring that they do engage in some kind of environmental destruction. OO says that the implementation of this is likely going to be corrupt, but I have two specific responses to this. One, this motion starts from the existence of this policy and assumes it is going to be implemented. We're told there is a strategy, we're told it's been announced by the government, we're told it's going to be adopted by 2026. This means that this debate happens at the level of 2026 and assumes and asks the question of whether, now that we're about to implement this model, this will actually yield the kind of outcomes that we want. Two, the specific reason why this will be done well is because of international pressure to be better for the environment. That is, there's specific pressure on specific pressure on the Indian government to be better for the environment. This kind of pressure ensures that there is a specific impetus to ensure that their implementation is not corrupt. But three, in their world, implementation is always going to be more corrupt because on their side, they have no regulation, but still need to punish companies that engage in wanton environmental destruction. These punishments are precisely where corruption happens, because this is where, for example, prosecutors can choose whether or not to prosecute a company that has engaged in specific and excessive emissions. This is where, for example, governments give kickbacks to companies, and this is where companies give kickbacks to government officials in order to issue specific regulations that are put against them. But they give four-ish mechanisms as to why this is going to be corrupt. The first thing they say is company and regional favoritism. But the point here is that favoritism is more likely to happen in their world of no regulation or of punishment. But the point is, in a world in which the market is responsible for the distribution of these market caps, this specific issue of favoritism falls away because the government is no longer a participant in the process of distributing the right to emit or the right to destroy the environment. Before the second two things, I'm running out of time. Anything from CEO?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, CEO.
Just to be specific here, when you say like big pharma will do innovation, what do you mean?
Big pharma will do big agricultural corporations have an incentive to either buy permits, which raises the cost for them and creates an impetus to find methods of raises the impetus for them to find methods of conducting agriculture that don't release as much emissions. OO then says that this policy is unpopular with the voter base, so the government will do this in a corrupt way. But this is likely popular because companies know, small farmers know they will be entitled to or be able to purchase a permit. And more importantly, big companies will buy these permits likely from small farmers rather than buying them from other big companies, given that there's a zero-sum problem here, in which I don't want to give my permits to another company that's likely going to outcompete me. That sort of thing. Lastly, they say India is too big. But again, I think I've really given you specific reasons why you have access to information about net carbon emissions and about net carbon outcomes. Lastly, is this an efficient way of protecting the environment? Abrar tells you that at a macro scale, one, this raises the cost of emissions. Two, this creates a potential source of income for small farmers. And three, this creates an impetus for innovation in the event that we proceed beyond agriculture to things like vehicles, to whatever manufacturing industries that we're involved in. I would extend this by talking about why this creates an impetus for specifically small farmers to sell off their permits to make money and then find methods of agriculture that don't destroy the environment, such as, for example, burning off the leftovers of the crops from the last season that more often than not lead to massive environmental destruction and air pollution. Very proud to propose.
I thank the previous speaker. I'm happy to call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Can you hear me? Okay, I'll take closing, put it in the chat, please. Please. All right. Starting in, I'm not going to do a countdown. That's like very 2021. Fuck it. Starting at my next word, as some people prefer to say. To be very clear about the framing in this debate, this is generally a deeply unpopular policy, especially like within communities and markets which are still very much growing and which need the additional profit margins to be able to operate and to be able to compete, especially with foreign competitors. Indian politicians and markets understand the effect that this motion has on market conditions. The condition which, like what DPM asks and actually answers himself is, why then would this be implemented? And the answer is very simple. This is a policy which is implemented facetiously to appease some voting bases within cities and to pay lip service to things like environmental protectionism and international treaties. However, this is neither done in a way which is efficient in achieving the goals it wants, nor is it done in a way which is equitable for the people which are affected by these policies. And this is the first path to victory from opening opposition. That is, if you buy our analysis that this is likely to be done in a very biased manner, we already win. However, though, we bring an entirely second strand of case in Zach, which goes entirely unresponded. That is, we explain to you why economic growth is a necessary prerequisite for you to be able to achieve green innovation in economies like India. Given that OG have no response to this, we already have to be beating them. Let me, however, go through the responses they have to our case and explain why they're insufficient. The first thing DPM says is that the alternative is going to be a world without regulation and that we're not being charitable. Look, I don't have to accept a counterfactual merely because it's convenient to the Deputy Prime Minister. That is, it is the case that they have to analyze the likely implementation of this scheme. If you look at the wording of the info slide, the information it provides isn't about the specific carbon trading scheme in India. The first paragraph is about carbon trading schemes in general. It is still very much within the debate to explain what this looks like in India, and we give you the analysis to explain the political and economic incentives held by the politicians and by the BJP. Therefore, this means that OG has failed to meet its burden of responding to our analysis and our implicit rebuttal to them. What they give then as like meager response to our claims about like political favoritism is like, firstly, they say that companies are going to be more abusive as to where the caps go if the caps are regulated by the markets. Our comparison aren't caps regulated by the market. Our comparison is like usually no caps, basically. What Doji tries to like sneak through instead, though, is this idea that you're going to instead have like the government trying to like micromanage and regulate and basically deal with individual companies or emissions. Two responses here. Firstly, like this is just like very empirically false. Like in a country where we have so many companies, where you have like an economy that is largely in many ways decentralized and has many different market actors, it is just not time efficient or possible for a central government to try to look at every single company and tell them, yes, you're meeting your caps, or no, you aren't. And the other thing, though, is that I also proved to you why you probably wouldn't really set those caps in the first place. So therefore, I just don't think that's a comparative. So that response cannot work against us. The second thing, and the last thing OG saying in rebuttal to us, is that this is going to be popular as a policy because the farmers can take those permits and sell them. Two responses here. Firstly, for all the reasons we give you, it is very unlikely that the small farmers, who tend to be politically insignificant, are going to get a significant amount of permits which they can sell in the first place. The big companies either will already be the recipients of most of the permits, especially the ones affiliated with the government, or they're going to be very easily able to buy them up in most cases. The second problem, though, is that OG have not met their burden of ever proving why the farming bloc is important enough to defeat the governmental capture that we have analyzed to you on side opening opposition. The thing is, the areas which are going to be the most polluted, where people are suffering the most, also tend to be the most weakly politically represented. Intuitively, that is why the situation has been allowed to rise in the first place, and therefore I don't think you're suddenly going to be able to protect these individuals. Why then, and I want to beat OG and Gov on a different metric here, why is it that even if you don't buy anything you've heard so far, we still win this debate from opening opposition? This is because this policy is horrible for an economy like India, even if it is implemented well and fairly. Few reasons here, many of which are already present in first speech and received no response. One, it is tougher for companies to turn a profit, and it leads to things like layoffs because you're not operating on tighter margins. That is, when you have to spend money to buy caps, that is money you're not spending either as profit to do things like basically reinvest in the business or attract investors, or less money you're using to pay and hire workers and grow your business in the first place. Second reason, though, is that you directly harm your economy against your primary manufacturing competitors. You're going up not against Western firms, and usually those will be the only other firms who are similarly handicapped in terms of like green conditions, but you're fighting economies like China, like Vietnam, or like Indonesia, who are trying to pace ahead of you and who you do need to keep up with. This is because they are the ones who are trying to manufacture the same things that you are, and they are the ones who are competing for things like Western market space, where you are going to be getting many of your profits to begin with. The third reason, though, is that you lose out on much foreign investment when you do this. If CG here are like smart, they might try to say like, there are some Western investors who give you money because you're green. Notably, though, the majority of foreign investors generally turn to these countries because of the high potential for economic growth. You both go to India because you see your investment growing rapidly, but also because you are betting in the conditions there in the long term. The fourth response, though, is that OG themselves concede that the smallest companies are going to be the least able to pay for these quotas. The impacts here are simple. Firstly, the condition of living for most of these people becomes far worse, and consumer prices go up for most people in India. These are 1.4 billion individuals who are now less able to pay for their bills and for their household goods. Second, though, the second part of our case about why this is a prerequisite to be able to do innovation goes entirely unresponded. That is, you cannot just import green innovation. You need to be able to have the technology and the analysis for the local industries and the local conditions that are necessary for you to be able to do better. Before I weigh the case, I'll take a PY from closing, please.
If this policy is so unpopular, don't you then have the incentive to do it as well as possible?
No, you have the incentive to like barely do it, and to do it to just make people think you're doing something as opposed to doing something in practice. But let me weigh this, because I want to like take the based position here and say why I don't care about the environment compared to the economy in India. Few parts of weighing here. Firstly, the government directs duty to its citizens is to provide jobs and to provide economic benefits. I want to note why industrialization is so urgent for countries like India, where you have many people who still work in subsistence farming, or many areas that have yet to be reached by crucial infrastructure, crucial services, or well-paying jobs. Most human rights treaties recognize the right to employment as fundamental, way ahead of things like a right to the environment. This is exactly because your ability to hold a job is both crucial for your ability to define the meaning of your life, but also to be able to pay for the most necessary things to meet your fundamental human needs. Things like food, things like shelter, things like your security, or things like your education and political expression all require you to have a healthy economic condition. But also, secondly, Zach explains to you why side government is committing a direct harm on these people. It is worse to harm someone directly than to merely fail to help them, as if by omission, and therefore, because we affect more individuals more intensely, you have to vote for side opening opposition. Thank you very much.
I thank the previous speaker. I'm happy to call upon the member of government.
Yeah, but you have some hours of order.
Am I audible?
Yeah. We lost them, right? Yeah.
Sorry, we got kicked out because of internet. Sorry.
I'm so sorry. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. So what is going to be our extension? I think OG does a great job of proving why climate change is bad and something that should be tackled with. Unfortunately, I don't think they actually engage with the case of opposition, which is that these policies won't be actually feasible, that these companies don't have capacity to implement these policies, and that this is basically going to ruin the standard of living of people who live in India. Food prices go up, standard of living go up, and all of these things. I think this is the main sort of challenge that OG has and doesn't have, and actually didn't do a good job of proving the capacity of these companies to actually do a good job. They sort of assert that although the opposition side also has to do some policies on climate change, we will give you actual reasons for like the actual case of opposition, which they clearly say they won't have any policies such as this when it comes to climate change. So why do these companies actually have the capacity to do this? Why can we fight climate change and at the same time not destroy the standard of living of Indians? Couple of things on this capacity. First of all, note that India is the largest growing market in the world. Literally, it has the largest growing population, largest population currently, but also the largest projection growth in the world. Note, it is also a largest growing consumer population in the world. They are rapidly developing their standard of living, much like China did. They are rapidly consuming more and more, which means there is projected rapid growth in their economic consumption and in everything that they produce, in all of the things that are happening within the economy. But also note that India is a large fucking country. It is abundant with resources. It is one of the few countries in the world that actually have all of the resources necessary for them to sustain themselves, meaning that this is a country that everybody wants to invest in because there is something for everyone, whether it be minerals or agriculture or any other thing. This is the exact reason why there is massive foreign investment in this country, purely because of its geography and its population. This is why these companies are so profitable and do get lots of customers and investment on all these things, because they get it is simply the most sort of desirable market. Secondly, note that India is simply the better alternative than all of the other markets that are comparable to India. Note for a couple of reasons. First of all, note that all of the other markets, such as China or Bangladesh, are heavily saturated. China has been developing for the past 20 years. It is heavily saturated with investment. This drives out profit because it creates more competition. This means that these companies in China are actually less profitable. Because India has only started to emerge as a very strongly emerging developing economy, they actually have all of this new investment, which means that it isn't saturated, which means that the profit margins are larger. This is precisely something that is also, drawing in more investment, more interest into this country. But note, secondly, the major competitive advantage of India as opposed to Bangladesh, Myanmar, India, China, or Vietnam is that it is politically and economically a free country. It is not a communist dictatorship. It is not unpredictable autocracy. This is the main reason why they drive so much investment, is because there is actual legislative system that actually functions and is transparent, which means investors like this because they know what is going to be the next move of Modi and all of these things. They can lobby and talk with these politicians. They know what the legislature is going to do. It's predictable. It is not like China, who puts in zero COVID policy and then all of the companies leave because they are scared shit of what actually is going to happen next and all of these things. This is why they draw in so much investment and what makes these companies so abundant with work and profit. Thirdly, know that India is in a very, very unique geopolitical situation currently for a couple of reasons. First of all, the war in Ukraine has completely devastated the exports of two of the largest grain exporting countries in the world. Ukraine and Russia accounted for more than 20% of the grain that was exported in the world, 20% of the grain that was produced. All of this has been sort of lowered to a large extent because these economies are now war economies that focus towards financing their war, and because there is lots of sanctions on all these countries to be able to export all of these things. This means that India has taken all of these demand, not only for grain, but for all the other agricultural resources that are used as subsidies for grain, for feeding livestock and all of these things. This means that there is much more growth in this sector of India's economy. But secondly, this is also a major difference in India's geopolitical situation. It is that we are growingly entering a new Cold War, where the two spheres of influence, US and China, are growingly putting sanctions on each other, growingly increasing tariffs, not just US and China, but all of their allies. We are seeing a cease in trade between all of these blocs, and this means that these countries can't no longer trade with each other. India comes into place as one of the very few countries which is actually unaligned within this bloc. It cooperates with the US. It also cooperates with China. It fucks with the US. It also fucks with US and Canada as well, as we saw very recently. This means that this country is uniquely positioned to actually negotiate and work with deals and investments from all of these blocs. This is the majority of this is basically the whole world, which is going to rapidly be not the case for many countries. It is very profitable for some economy to actually be able to sit on two chairs of the Cold War. Fourthly, note that India is simply given that agriculture and all of these industries are crucial for its basically like security of this country, because you cannot allow yourself to run out of agriculture and all these things. This means that India heavily, as a state, also subsidizes these agricultural economies, all of these things. This means that these industries are strong because they want their farmers to be able to succeed, to make a living, all of these things. Sixthly, note that precisely because this is also an unpopular policy, Modi has an incentive to make this policy actually popular, to prove that it's going to work, to crack down on corruption, to make this policy actually be able to function. But note, even though I have proven you with a couple of mechanisms why this isn't actually going to dramatically reduce the capacity of these companies to be able to function, even if the prices do at some point rise a little bit, note that Modi is a populist. He wants his populace to be happy. This means that he is going to also subsidize the people to be able to go through this transition, precisely because he is pressured by the West and all of the other allies to actually put all of these climate change policies. This means that to be able to please the West, he also needs to subsidize food and all of these things. If it comes to that, if the prices go up, he isn't going to drop this policy. So why all of this is very important? I think two main reasons obeying why climate change is the most important thing in this debate. Note, it is simply devastating for everybody in the world, and it is going to be more and more devastating as we lose control over tackling climate change. But it is especially devastating for people in India who have to deal with monsoons and hurricanes. Secondly, and this is on the principle, responsibility towards the future. Even if prices of food rise a bit today, I think still we are still responsible to protect people in the future. I don't think we should care more about people today than people in the future. This is why even if we get this run, it is important to also think about people in the future as moral actors as well. Thank you.
And I thank the previous speaker. I'm happy to call upon the member of the opposition.
Alrighty. Can someone put timestamps in the chat? I'm debating on my phone. It is on 5%. I can only multitask so much. Lovely. First on CG. For those of you recall, there were giant farmers' protests in India that Modi caused when he massively got rid of those price subsidies and things that would guarantee prices for farmers. So the idea that Modi is super pro-farmer is not only incredibly ahistorical, it's also incredibly unintuitive. If anything, he's known as a strong man who doubles down on previous policy decisions. So why he suddenly U-turns is kind of a profound thing. The first thing I want to do is just deal with this core clash that seems to exist on government bench, is that they accept the economy might be fucked, but guys, the environment. First, I want to just frame out a lot of this analysis. First, on dispersion. Most people who live in city areas do not get pollution that causes all the smog things from actual agriculture. It comes from giant, heavy motor vehicles, as they concede in OG, that travel through these cities. Second, if it's not that, it's a giant coal power plant that burn huge amounts of smoke into the atmosphere. It's unclear why some small farmer having some small little fire is going to have a massive knowledge. Secondly, in terms of the global climate change, realistically, 1.5 degrees is probably baked in the cake. The rest of the world produces a huge amount. This is one sector in one country. It's very unclear what the margin is. Thirdly, on other policy existing in open government, this is a little orthogonal to the debate because a lot of policy, i.e. the banning of dangerous and hazardous substances, the engaging in other previous things, are very much not to do with cap and trade schemes. But secondly, even if they were, counterintuitively, this slows it down. Because if government bench is right, and this really fucks over farmers, then what happens is Modi goes, you see what happens when we engage with the West? We fuck over our own people, we can't do this. He uses the harms of this to excuse the fact he doesn't implement it in other areas. Finally, what is the comparative? 1/3 of malnourished children in the world live in India. This is why you have huge stunted growth rates. It's why you have poor educational standards. It's why you have stunted time. The vast majority of these people live in these rural areas we're talking about. The people who suffer from going home hungry at night. And the trade-off we're going to make is simple. This massively diminishes people, irregardless if the policy is done well or poorly, and harms the people the government bench cares so much about protecting. The first thing I want to do is I want to zoom out, because realistically, Modi isn't like Thanos, and he is probably like Jesus, as OG and OO try to go about. I think what the realistic characterization here is that like Modi has engaged in significant land reforms, which has made it far easier to purchase land. And secondly, and this is important, they've allowed the setup of large big agro farms that have started taking place in Punjab and other areas within India. Why is this important? Because it specifically explains, I'm going to explain, why this policy specifically screws over small farmers with the advent of large Western MNCs moving in. Why is this the case? The first thing, let's say that they're equitably distributed. Permits come out. Some big farms get them, some small farms don't. The issue is that big farms have disproportionate price advantages that allow them to price out small farmers for a variety of reasons. The first reason, poor farmers have limited access to credit, bank, loans, the ability to take money and to recoup the promise of future things. Secondly, large agriculture companies are hedged across multiple farms. So if there's crop failure in an individual farm, they're easily done. Which leads to the third and obvious outcome. The average amount of financial money that a poor Indian farmer has is very low relative to a large agriculture farm. So what happens is that big agro creates regional monopolies by pricing people out. They spy at prices that local farmers cannot afford off of them. And local farmers who don't get the opportunity to get permits cannot buy permits, and even if they do, in very small quantities. Secondly, the large technological innovations, pointing out here, this is important, do not exist for small farmers. Because the premise of the government bench claim here is that, guys, so what happens now is we innovate and we solve these issues. This does not happen. Why is that the case? The reason is because many poor farmers do not have the technological advantages necessary to innovate because they cannot afford them. What does that look like? That looks like more efficient, cheaper American tractors or other products that come in that are able to clear land or plow land at cheaper rates. That means you don't have to do crop burn-offs because you can easily cull and plow field. The problem is that if you're a poor farmer and you rely primarily on more of a manual labor subset, it is harder to do this. But this leads to an important issue, therefore, where even if you get the same permit, you cannot produce the same level, which makes you significantly less competitive in the market. Thirdly, the problem with this is that you can also maintain crops less. You can't bring your tractors out into the field. You can't do systemic watering cycles in the same way. You also can't engage in the same level of attention to individual plants. What does this mean? It means that farmers can't rely on pre-existing agriculture strains that exist within the ground. And the reason for this is simple. These were designed to have high degrees of maintenance to produce those same high degrees of crop yields. But as I've already framed, you're already fucked on the crop yield front. How do you maintain production? Well, what we're currently seeing is there's an increasing shift to genetically modified products. Monsanto is coming in big. This happens to some degree symmetrically, I concede, but it's significantly worse on government's bench for a variety of reasons. The first reason it's worse is because it means you're using Monsanto's new line of crops that they're producing, which are significantly worse for two reasons. First, there's literally no experimental evidence on the outsides of the pesticides you need to use to maintain them. And the second reason is probably worse, which is these have very, very limited capacities for recourse. The final reason it's bad is obvious. If a plant can survive in significantly lower maintenance, the reason for this is often because it sucks up significantly more nutrients for things that are stable in the ecosystem, i.e. the soil. Why is that bad? Because you get accelerated rates of soil degradation. So what this looks like is if you're an individual farmer, you can't cycle multiple levels of crop in the same field because there's a lot more intensity in the use of like industrial equipment. To say that like I can't grow like many different things in the same field or like do like multiple sets of crop cycles. What that means, therefore, is that you use single crop rotations. The problem with this is that you have accelerated topsoil degradation. This wins a long-run clash because it explains even if now you maintain marginally better use, in the long run, farmers can produce less and less year on year. The fourth thing to point out here, and this is important, is they shift from high protein sources. But before that, I'll compete from OG. Go for it.
Yeah. Small farmers are outcompeted on price anyway. Not sure why it gets worse. Now at least they can trade permits at least. And so the fewer, they need also fewer permits. They don't need 1,000 permits like big firms. And
because there's a clear fallacy that's going on here, which is that you're equivalating domestic like international demand. So it is true that like big farms have an advantage. All that happens is the market setting price is good for everyone. They just agree on that slightly higher price. What happens now is that big farms have such a drastic advantage, it makes the problem significantly worse. Why is this a bad thing? The final thing I want to talk about here is high protein sources, and this is really important. Often, animals produce significantly more carbon than plants. For a variety of reasons, OG concedes, but I'll re-explain. Firstly, like they fart and they shit and they die and they produce methane. Secondly, you need to feed them with crops which need to grow somewhere. Thirdly, and intuitively, even when you do produce them, often the degradation, like the ammonia they produce from like when they shit and it goes in the soil, produces a lot more CO2. The problem with this is that India is a very vegetarian country. And so often a lot of the iron and protein sources like dairy come from things like dairy. Now, if you don't have easy access to substitutes, the problem that happens is farmers have to switch to producing agriculture to make that same calorific ending. Because shockingly, not everyone sells this stuff. Some people just eat what they grow. The problem with this is intuitive. You have significantly worse nutritional rates. What is it at the end of the day? Government bench wanted to help people suffering from climate change and environmental disasters by making their living standards significantly worse and degrading their long-term prospects of escape. I'm very happy to win the debate in closing opposition.
I thank the previous speaker, and I'm happy to call upon the government whip.
The main problem is CEO is that it is incredibly uncompetitive. They list you like 5 reasons why the multinational corporations will outcompete the small farmers, and this is just an extra one. I don't see how this is competitive in any world. I think that they will 5 or 6 reasons how they outcompete them. I don't know how this is a tipping point, but I want to flip their case. Notice how the flip is the following: small farmers pollute less, therefore they are able to sell their carbon emission offsets, whatever, and then actually upgrade to better machinery. Why is this so? Firstly, notice how a lot of these small farmers work, it's handwork, it's only animals, it's no very big machinery, factories, whatever, fertilizer that the big company grows. This means that the big company have a lot more emissions, which means that they need to buy the emission offsets from the small farmers. So we've proved that actually on our side of the house, these small farmers are better. Their second point about nutritional value, come on, guys, if I have to defend that this Modi guy is going to starve the entire nation out of nutrients, I really don't want to do this debate. I think in most cases, the leader doesn't want to starve its entire population, that they want to count in how important meat is when they're calculating the little whatever carbon emission. So I think that this completely takes out closing opposition. They cannot win this debate. Secondly, weighing against opening government. I think that the way we weigh against opening governments is they don't prove how to say any capacity of the companies to do this without them starving their people. The only thing that they say, Bengali is prosperous, no reasons. Abrar gave you 5 or 6 different reasons why these companies are in a specific, how to say, in a specific time, in a specific condition, they can actually trade off a little bit of their profit and still keep the workers, still keep the same amount of prices. Because of Ukraine, now India has become, how to say, the biggest exporter of grain and rice. Secondly, all of the prosperity that Abrar talks about, what does it mean? It means that every single company that is operating in India, it is already operating on massive margins. What does it mean? Because you're operating on massive margins, you're able, how to say, to afford all of these carbon emission offsets, whatever, which means that you still have the capacity to innovate without, how to say, firing any of your workforce, because when you fire your workforce, you also decrease the productivity and the profit. So we uniquely prove that they have, how to say, the capacity to do this. Moreover, let's move. Secondly, they only, how to say, assert that the comparative is some other carbon policy. This is a supports debate. They do not have that, how to say, they do not have the same that fiat. So that this is why we're at least second in this debate. Now let's tackle opening opposition. Opening opposition wants to have the cake and eat it too. They say, this will starve millions of people. But when I ask a POI, they say, oh no, this is just a small policy. policy, they want to, trick the people. You cannot run both cases. I'll give you a lot of reasons why Modi has a good incentive to do this. Firstly, and this is an important piece of weighing. So why is the climate change extremely important in this debate? Notice how India every year is ravaged by monsoons. You get very massive, floods. You get unbearable rain, which destroys the crops, it destroys the people. Secondly, it is on massive risk of typhoons. Notice how typhoons are created more when the temperature gets high. In 1980, a typhoon ravaged Bengal and Bangladesh, killing 300,000 people. This is something that is very proximate to India. Moreover, a lot of landslides happening because of the monsoon season. And fourthly, enormous, temperatures in the summer. What does it mean? It means that tens of thousands of people every year are basically dying from this disease. And this is not from these causes. This is precondition to you having a salary. So this is the most important thing. But this also proves an incentive why Modi has to do this well. Secondly, they also want to be a pioneer in this kind of technology, to develop this green technology, to sell it to the other companies. Thirdly, Modi wants to stay in power. Notice how they say, small farmers are politically insignificant. This is a lie. Small farmers are a very important voting bloc in India. And because of that, because there are so much, they want to appease them. Fourthly, they want this would be an opposition victory for Modi's opposition. If this is a policy that is done badly. So I think that Modi has a lot of incentive to do this well. But notice how if he wants to do a corrupt policy, he can do a different corrupt policy. So basically, if he wants to do it corrupt, he can do it on either side of the house. So we debate in a land when Modi wants to do this well. The other reasons why they give us why this won't be done well is because of regional favoritism. Notice how Modi, because of this, he has an incentive to send a lot of supervisors, a lot of inspections to these regional headlords. If they find out corruption, they'll be put in jail, and this is something that is very bad. Thirdly, they tell you, the economy, it is a big country. Yes, it is a big country, but China is also a big country. They have been the most prosperous country. They have been massive railways, massive whatever else, massive infrastructure policy project. Just because it is a big country, it does mean that this is something that is impossible to do. We gave you a lot of reasons why this is possible. Opening opposition, yes.
You misrepresent our case. There's no contradiction between what we tell you, because we tell you either Modi won't do anything and the policy is going to be shit, or he's going to do too much and people are going to be starving.
Okay, I gave you a lot of reasons why he literally doesn't have the incentive to starve people, because he'll get thrown out in the next election, especially because not popular now. Moreover, Abrar tells you that no matter what happens, because India is in such a prosperous position, that Western companies will still want to arrive in India because of their massive profits they are able to reap. So what happens? Basically, on our side of the house, we are still able to keep the workers, the jobs, the low prices and everything else because of its very specific economically good position. But even if this is not the case, notice how we are still able to, to have smaller carbon emissions, which means that less people die from the monsoon season, from landslides, from different, floods, from typhoons and everything else, from temperature, which I think we can trade off less people dying for your, cabbage costing a little like 2 cents more or 2% more. So I think that this isn't the most important thing in debate. We can even trade off some people maybe having lower paychecks, a little bit of a higher, standard when it comes to crops, for me, more people actually being able to live at the end of the day. So vote closing government.